We do have the Uptake live with us today, and I would hate for a telephone to cut into their live stream. So, my name is Jeremy Wieland, and I thank you all for attending this inaugural forum of Think Again, Minnesota. I would like to welcome you on behalf of our other directors, Vicky Oshiro, Brian Hannanen, Carol Werrer. And I would also like to extend gratitude to our co-sponsors for tonight. You may have noticed tables in the hall, and I'm sure many of you represent or are already familiar with some of these groups: the Bloomington Progressive Issues Forum, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, Minnesota Interfaith Power and Light, the Minnesota Renewable Energy Society, MN 350, the North American Water Office, Oxfam, the Pew Environment Group, Small Business Minnesota, the Will Steiger Foundation, of course, the City of Bloomington for allowing us to, have our event here this evening, and Bill Sorum with the Uptake in the back. He has also requested, please try to avoid using the wireless network into the room so that we can reserve the bandwidth for his live stream. So, the purpose of Think Again Minnesota today and moving forward is to engage citizens in exploring public policy that can create opportunity and prosperity in which everyone can share. Why the name Think Again Minnesota? Because citizens and voters don't always have the right information. Sometimes we have some false assumptions. So we're intent on creating forums to correct some of that, make certain that we have the proper information. We have an understanding of how green energy can make us independent. We have an understanding of how green energy impacts the environment and climate. At least we're taking that for granted for this evening's conversation. Okay. For tonight, I hope everyone here can set aside those questions and instead focus on the economic issues. So tonight, in the midst of the economic turmoil that has opened the 21st century, Think Again Minnesota wants to explore how green energy can benefit a broad cross-section of pocketbooks. 2008, financier George Soros told Bill Moyers that green energy, green business, could be the motor of the world economy. So tonight, let's talk about that motor, how wealth is generated by that motor, and how we can share it. Our moderator for tonight is John Dahl. He's a local business owner and former senator in the Minnesota legislature, where he served as vice chair of that body's energy committee. So please, let's give him a very warm welcome this evening.
Want to operate from here? Is that what we wanted, from behind the microphone? Okay, thank you. And welcome, everybody, and thank you for the introduction. I see a lot of friendly faces here and inspiring faces, because I know a lot of you folks have been working on these issues for many years, and we're in a good place now. There's a nexus of forces coming together and a lot of good policy that's been generated over the past few years, and I'm glad that I was able to be a part of that at the legislature. But we're now at that point where we're going to start to pull all these things together and actually connect the dots, bring people together, and get some of this work actually implemented. In fact, one of our guests I'll introduce, I worked on the PACE legislation last year, which was the property assessed clean energy, which we're now working with the city of Edina to be the first city to actually implement that program. So we're really excited about that. We have three very, very good speakers tonight, and I think you'll all be really pleased at the end of the session tonight when we get to the question and answers to really engage with them, the work that they're doing. First, we have Mr. Lynn Hinkle. He's with the Minnesota Solar Energy Association. He's their policy director. This past year, he also was one of the architects for the governor's executive order that directs state agencies to reduce their energy consumption in their buildings by at least 20%. And in the process of building that infrastructure, allowing counties and cities and school districts to engage in that as well. And hopefully through that process, we'll be able to move that infrastructure to the private sector. Also with us is John Farrell. He's the Senior Policy Analyst for the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and that's for the energy part of the policy, if I'm not mistaken. And also, kind of following up at the end here, we'll have Mr. George Crocker, who is he's the Executive Director for the North American Water Office. Now, they do not sell bottled water, but they do a lot of work on clean energy issues, and he's been doing it a long time. They were frequent guests at the Capitol and in my office on many issues while I was at the Senate and the Energy Committee. But with that, I guess we were going to start off with some presentations. We'll do that for about 20 minutes, 15 to 20 minutes for each of our speakers, and then we'll follow that up with a question and answer period for the final half of an hour. With that, I'd like to introduce Lynn Hinkle.
Again, my name is Lynn Hinkle, and thanks, John. We'll just give it a try right now. Pleased to have worked with former Senator Dahl on some, what I think were some important legislative advances, some policies that, I'm inclined to want to stand in front of a podium. I, in a previous life, was worked at the Ford plant and was a union rep for 20 years. And when we'd have union meetings, people were a little put off by the fact that we would stand behind the podium. It was more like, what, are you afraid of us? You know, this is our union. You know, you're supposed to be right out here amongst us. So I got trained in that. It's a habit that I think is overall a good habit, but that's the reason I chose to stand there. So what I'm going to talk about briefly is how a suite of policies, primarily solar policy, is a jobs engine for Minnesota. So what is this clean energy jobs for Minnesota? It's made up of, it's being driven by a number of forces that in the past we would have not put together. There's a group called the Blue-Green Alliance, which is a formal organization writ large, but it also is a movement of people, meaning there's the blue, the union movement, the trade union movement, and the green, meaning the environmental movement, who have come together in a significant configuration that's having major impact. On the other side, you see business and labor. MNSEA, the Minnesota Solar Energy Industry Association, is an example, is an expression of that configuration of both business and labor. When we did the work that Senator Dahl talked about to generate support for the executive order that got signed on April 8th by the governor, that's Executive Order 1112, that whole process was driven by a very clear expression of that unity. So clear that when Lieutenant Governor Pretner-Solon came into the room, the first expression before she sat down is, "This is a heck of a coalition." And that's what's happening right now, is that you're seeing folks that may not have worked with each other in the past collaborating and making jobs and economic development in our state. Is it the basis of a new economic development process? I think the answer to that is absolutely. It's not just the collaboration. We're having real results. Those results come from jobs that are, roughly speaking, about energy efficiency, doing the retrofits of our buildings to make them more sustainable, and distributed generation of installations on buildings like solar, ground source heating, small wind, energy storage on site. And what I think has happened is that in Minnesota, you've got what I call the trifecta. What does that mean? Well, you've got a really significant policy that's been put in place by the governor that's basically encouraging the state to utilize existing statutory provisions for doing what are called guaranteed energy savings retrofits of state and other public buildings all across the state. It's conservatively estimated that over the next 3 years we're going to be able to do $200 million worth of retrofits, and that's going to generate over 3,000 jobs, not just in installation, but throughout the entire manufacturing supply chain. For example, McQuay, which is a significant HVAC manufacturer, has several manufacturing facilities right here in Minnesota that are going to benefit from the accelerated installation of that's heating, ventilation, and AC, HVAC. What about some of the other policy initiatives? Solar is coming on strong. We're promoting legislation that would significantly increase the deployment of solar across the state. We're calling for, and you can see the little logo up in the right-hand corner, 10% installation of solar by 2030. It's a big number by 2030, but what we're looking at is smaller increments for the next 10 years of roughly 58 to 60 megawatts. We've been working on changing or at least targeting our legislative initiatives so that it focuses primarily on public buildings. And isn't that a great complement to what I just talked about in terms of having an executive order that talks about retrofits that pay for themselves and a piece of legislation that would work with that to install a significant amount of solar on public buildings. The last piece is what's called PACE. Senator Dahl mentioned that we had the pleasure of getting that piece of legislation implemented a couple of years ago. We're going to come back to this session and do some more work on it. If you thought those other two pieces of policy were going to be or had the potential to provide a significant number of jobs in the state, this is the big one. This is where you're going to see hundreds of millions of dollars worth of finance, building retrofits, capacity for plug-in and for renewables across a broad sector of commercial and industrial and eventually residential properties around the state. So you put those three together and it's the trifecta. It's an enormous jobs engine for this state, and it's not at all unclear why labor, and in many cases we've got unions in this state that have unemployment rates as high as 40%, are very, very interested in those three pieces of legislation. So instead of being the people who are on the sidelines listening to some environmentalists talk about the importance of a green economy, a clean energy economy, they're the people that are holding the mic and saying, let's go. These are jobs, these are good family-sustaining jobs, and I'm going to talk some more about that when we get into the discussion about Solar Works for Minnesota. These are family-supporting jobs. That means that you can essentially pay for your family's essential financial needs with the wage without supplement. They're jobs that grow all across the state. They're not just metrocentric. They're going to be installed on buildings wherever in Minnesota. They're jobs that provide energy independence and move us towards circulating even more money in our economy that currently is being shipped out of the state for a whole variety of fossil fuel and other sources that we don't have in our state. So we have to export virtually all of our funds for energy to sources that are outside of the state, at least for the fuel source. The Solar Energy Standard makes Minnesota a target for investment. I'll talk some more about that later. And then the new reliable grid with solar at the center creates a new cluster of job opportunities for the state. They're good-paying jobs all over Minnesota. And you can see what those jobs look like. I'm going to turn my back briefly to you, but they're jobs installing solar projects. They're jobs designing and engineering solar products. They're manufacturing materials, equipment, and components. And let me talk about that a little bit. Right now in Minnesota, not somewhere in the misty future, there are over 3,000 direct and indirect manufacturing jobs in the solar manufacturing supply chain. Where are those jobs? They're in Rochester at Crenlo MCOR, building enclosures for inverters. They're at Dispatch, right down the road here, that are building the ovens for solar cells that are shipped everywhere around the world. They're at Silicon Energy. My friend Bill Richmond is working with Silicon Energy up on the Iron Range. 10K Solar, which is literally a few blocks away from here, is an original equipment manufacturer of solar modules. Vico in White Bear Lake, Northfield Automation in Northfield, Infinity Precision, which has teamed up with them and Dispatch to build turnkey installations for solar manufacturing that are being shipped around the world. This is a big deal for Minnesota, not just because it's going to get a lot of installations, but it's going to create a lot of jobs throughout the supply chain. And I think everybody understands that when we can revitalize and restore the capacity of our manufacturing sector, we've really got something going on. And that's exactly what's happening in Minnesota with the legislation and the policies that we're promoting for solar on public property, on public buildings. It's lots of jobs. I'm just going to briefly point out that if you're a policymaker and you've got to make a decision about how to spend tax dollars, you want them to be the biggest bang for the buck. And that's exactly what solar is. Per $1 million, it's the best return on jobs, far better than fossil fuel. It's not maybe quite as good as energy efficiency, but nobody promotes energy efficiency, as you've already heard, as much as we do in the solar industry. So it's a significant return on investment if you're looking at how to spend tax dollars. Well, what about megawatts? Well, there again, the greatest density of jobs per megawatt is from solar. And that's not just the solar installations. Remember, I was just talking about the entire supply chain. So that density of jobs is the result not only of what happens on rooftops and in parking lots where we install ground-mounted solar, but from the manufacturing jobs, many of which we already have right here in Minnesota. And the final thing that I want to say is that these jobs, as I just pointed out on the slide prior to this, are jobs across the entire spectrum of educational experience. So you don't need to have a college degree to go to work at manufacturing as a machinist at Dispatch. You don't necessarily have to have a college degree to be a manufacturing specialist at 10K up the road. So there's some diversity that is supplied, not just a certain density. So there's some equality that is embedded in the kind of jobs that we're talking about, and I think that's important for the society that we're building going forward. They're good jobs now. You know, when you talk about nuclear, and, you know, the Minnesota Solar Energy Industry Association hasn't come out with a negative position condemning nuclear. But what we do say is this. When you're making a choice as a policymaker about where to spend tax dollars, and the choice is between putting money into something that from idea to installation takes 18 months versus 18 years, and you got people that are sitting on the bench right now looking for the intervention that would put them back to work, where do you think they should spend their money? Where do you think we as a society need to focus our resources? The answer is fairly clear. It's not just that the jobs are everywhere in the state. It's not just that they're manufacturing and installation. It's not just that they're more diverse. They come on a lot faster, and that's a critical issue. Energy independence. Right now, Minnesota spends $20 billion, that's with a B, shipping money for electrical generation, fuel, and heating out of our state every year. Every year. It's gone down perhaps just a little bit during the recession, but this is Energy Information Agency's administration statistics from a couple of years ago, and that's significant. If we just put a fairly modest amount of solar on rooftops on public buildings and in commercial industrial buildings through PACE, we can keep a significant amount of that money that currently is leaving our state and recycle it in our communities. It's a big deal. It isn't just energy independence, which is an important concept. It's that money that we preserve gets recycled in our economy and generates even more jobs than the jobs that I was just talking about. Quickly, what I want to talk about here, that really cool graph over on the right, basically is telling you one thing, that solar and other renewables are vastly less subsidized than any other source of fossil fuel by a margin of, or a ratio of 50 to 12. Now, what's interesting is that few people know this or understand it because the subsidies for fossil fuel have been around for so long that they're now buried in the tax code. Ours aren't. For solar, you know right now there's a vital and vibrant discussion in Congress, and there should be, about the kind of incentives, the kind of tax credits that are going to be generated for solar. Now, we're not asking for that transparency to go away with solar. We'd just like to have the same transparency for all the other subsidies that are going to fossil fuel. And while we're at it, let's get the same amount. If we had the same amount of subsidies that are going to oil, gas, nuclear through the tax system, well, just suffice it to say, we wouldn't be having many of the discussions that we're having right now about how to scale up solar. The last thing I'll say, and then turn it over to my friends, John and George, is that if we're able to finally send a demand signal through a solar policy that requires 58, 60 megawatts, which is only 1/10 of 1%. It's not a lot. It's only 1/10 of 1% over the next 10 years to scale up to 10%, going up to 2030. That will send a significant enough demand signal that it will attract interest from investors who are looking all around this country to decide where they're going to land capital, where they're going to take their investment dollars so that they can get the synergies that come from a cluster. Now, I've already talked about two things that this state has. We've got a manufacturing supply chain. You got to have that if you're going to get that kind of investment. You've got to have a general positive environment for this kind of activity, a clean energy economy. So having an RES, having a standard for energy efficiency, having standards for reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, all of that is important. The last thing that we need in that grouping is a demand signal. And everyone talks about the importance of bringing those three things together, and there are a few states that are competing. And they're going to move on this faster than Minnesota is if we don't position ourselves with that demand signal in 5 to 10 years. The opportunities that we could have obtained from that kind of synergistic development of cluster in this state will have gone by us. That's essentially all I wanted to say, other than here's the map. You know, you can't really see it that well back here, but those spots are indicators of where there are installations for solar all over the state. We've got a jobs engine that's developed in Minnesota. It's energy efficiency, it's pace, and it's a solar policy that is going to create an enormous amount of economic activity in our state.
Thank you, Lynn. And you can see by his presentation why he was able to get this executive order through. He's very convincing. Nice presentation. Next up, I'd like to introduce John Farrell from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance.
All right. Well, thank you all for coming. It's great to have you here. I don't think it was mentioned in the introduction, but I also volunteer with Think Again Minnesota and have been very interested in getting this organization launched and excited that clean energy is kind of the way that we're starting our program. As Senator Dahl said, I'm from the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. We have been around for about 37 years. Based in Washington, D.C., and also in our office in Minneapolis, where I work out of. Our sort of institutional focus is on how we can help communities retain the most of their human and natural resources especially in ways that benefit their economy. And so my work then on clean energy is focused on how we can envision what's happening in the electricity system. And what we're seeing really is a transformation that's happening from what I call a centralized electricity system, where we're getting our electricity from a few large fossil fuel power plants, and that electricity comes to people in kind of a one-way street, to a system that's going to be much more democratic, where electricity is produced at all levels by homeowners, by businesses, and still by the utility, and that the utility takes more of a backseat in terms of managing those electricity flows rather than being kind of the sole provider to people. So that our work then is focused on how to help communities take advantage of this transformation that's happening, what we're calling the democratization of the electricity system, and to retain more of the economic benefits of that for their community. What really has energized our work on energy is actually a report that we put out last year that we call Energy Self-Reliant States, in which we looked at the enormous potential for what we call electricity self-reliance. And this is, the concept of this is, if you look at a state, what amount of its electricity could it generate from renewable sources within its own borders, rather than, as Lynn talked about, as we do in Minnesota, sending millions or billions of dollars out of our economy to meet our energy needs. And what we found was that 31 states have enough renewable energy resources from a variety of sources within their borders to meet all of their electricity needs, and that every state could get at least a quarter of its electricity from in-state renewable energy resources. So there's this tremendous potential to move toward energy self-reliance in a way that also is going to be very beneficial to our economies and our communities. So to drill down to look at Minnesota and to give you a number that you can read, unlike in the first map, Minnesota has enough renewable energy resources to get 2,500% of its electricity from the wind and sun and other sources. There's just a tremendous amount of energy resources in Minnesota, and we currently get something on the order of between 5 and 10% of our electricity from renewable sources within our state. So we have a long road to hoe, but we also have a whole lot of potential. When you break it down, I left a little gap there because I'm going to talk about the biggest source in a minute. But I wanted to do this to illustrate the fact that Minnesota has resources other than wind power, which I think most people will be familiar with. In fact, about a quarter of our electricity could come from rooftop solar alone. I could go on for a little while about why we looked at it in particularly that fashion, but suffice to say that there are desert solar plants planned for the Southwest that have drawn the ire of a lot of environmentalists, and that we have lots of unoccupied roof space that nobody has a particular interest in keeping unoccupied, that we could put solar on in the state of Minnesota. And so it seemed sensible to look at it from that particular perspective, and that we could get a quarter of our electricity, as I said, from rooftop solar. We could also get some additional electricity from combined heat and power opportunities, where we have industries that could use the waste heat from power plants in their industrial processes, as well as from a few additional what they call micro hydro projects, where instead of sort of damming up an entire river, that you take advantage of the stream flow without really impacting the run of that facility. But of course, the big source for renewable energy in Minnesota is wind, and it's the one that we've really successfully populated under a number of different policies, not the least of which is our 25% renewable energy by 2025 standard. And in fact, we have so much wind that we really could get 2,400% of our state's electricity need just from the wind alone. We have an enormous resource. And it's not just that we have this incredible technical potential, but this data comes from the National Renewable Energy Laboratories, and this is based on commercially viable wind sources, wind that we can use right now to produce electricity at prices that are competitive with the energy that we're already using. So Minnesota has this really enormous resource that's largely untapped despite our best efforts so far, and we have a ways to go in terms of what we can really realize in terms of the potential. So I want to pause for a second. I've shown you so far what Minnesota can accomplish, and there's really an enormous opportunity. I want to then change the conversation a little bit to talk about the value of that energy. And so we'll take a nod here to what's the cost of electricity from these renewable resources that are inside our borders. How does that compare to the electricity we currently get? But then what's all the value that we can get from that beyond just electricity? I think a lot of times, especially at the legislature, when we talk about policy for renewable energy, it becomes a debate about pennies per kilowatt hour. And ironically, the biggest value of our renewable energy resource has nothing to do with the fact that it's going to provide electricity. And so we'll get into that a little bit more. So here's my nod to the folks who want to talk about cost. If you just take the raw cost of building a wind turbine or putting up a solar power plant in the state of Minnesota in 2011 based on the best prices in the country, and you take into account none of those incentives that are available from the federal, state, or local governments, it's about 11 cents a kilowatt hour to get power from a wind turbine, maybe about 10 cents as prices have been coming down, and about, I believe, 23 cents from your solar facility. But of course, we live in the real world, and when a utility buys that power, those facilities are getting those federal tax incentives. And so the cost that you're actually going to see to the ratepayer from a wind power plant is about 7 cents a kilowatt hour, or a little bit less. And from a solar power facility in Minnesota, it would be about 14 cents per kilowatt hour. And for comparison, I've put up there the 3 different rate classes supplied electricity by Minnesota utilities. This is a statewide average in 2011 provided by the Energy Information Administration, the federal kind of clearinghouse for energy information. And you can see that wind and solar power are already competitive or very nearly competitive with the prices that we're already paying for electricity in the state of Minnesota. So let us dispense with the cost argument. Because I think it's fairly convincing that we're already very close, if not already past that marker when it comes to our renewable energy resources, and talk about where the real value is. And I think Lynn already gave us a really good overview of what it is that we can come to expect from our renewable energy resources, and solar in particular. This is from a study at the University of California, Berkeley, that does a similar comparison to what Lynn was talking about, that looks at the jobs per megawatt of capacity. And as you can see, solar and wind run away in terms of their ability to create jobs and per unit of energy capacity delivered compared to our traditional fossil fuel resources. So when we want to talk about, as Lynn said, where we're going to spend our public dollars, it makes sense to look at our renewable energy resources to get those jobs. And to put it all together for you, if we were looking at supplying Minnesota 100% with renewable resources, and just to put this in perspective, of course, we would never be able to entirely do solar and wind. We would need some form of energy storage or some backup for the times when neither the wind is blowing nor the sun is shining. But if we were to do that, to get 90% of our electricity in Minnesota from wind and 10% from solar, as a nod to the 10% solar standard that's being considered at the legislature, it would add $22 billion to our economy and create 50,000 new jobs. And to put that in perspective a little bit, the total state GDP on an annual basis is about $250 billion. So about a 10% increase in our state economic activity from going to 100% renewable and focusing on the renewable resources that we have within the state of Minnesota. Just a tremendous potential in terms of getting clean electricity, but an even larger potential in terms of what the economic opportunity could be. But I think there's kind of an important thing that most folks won't talk about when we talk about the economic opportunities from renewable energy, and that's who owns it. There's a big difference between putting up a wind power plant in southwestern Minnesota that's owned by Iberdrola, the Spanish multinational corporation, and one that can be owned by a collective organization of Minnesota farmers, or by the city of Wilmer, or by some other organization that is going to keep those dollars local. And you know, the best way to think about this is essentially when you build that wind power plant, who's going to receive the revenue from selling that electricity? Is it somebody in Minnesota, or isn't it? Because if it's not going to be, if we take and get ourselves to 100% energy self-reliance, that we get all of our electricity from within our borders, but none of it is owned by Minnesotans, we'll miss out on the larger portion of our economic opportunity. We'll send $33 billion in economic activity to other states. We'll send 50,000 jobs somewhere else. And the reason that we miss out on that opportunity is that, according to the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, there's an economic multiplier of between 1.5 and 3.5 times for every dollar that is spent at a locally owned renewable energy facility compared to one that is absentee owned. And there's about a 2 times multiplier for the number of jobs that it creates locally. And it's very simple. Think about a sandwich shop, for example. And let's say you have a locally owned sandwich shop. The owner is likely to live locally. They're going to pay salaries to local employees. They're probably going to source more of their materials locally. And they're also going to keep the revenue from that sandwich shop in the state of Minnesota because they live here, so they're going to spend that profit in Minnesota. On the other hand, consider, for example, a Subway. It's a franchise, and a lot of that revenue from that facility is going to come from out of state, and they're going to source from their national suppliers, not necessarily from in the state of Minnesota. The same kind of thing applies to when we are working on energy resources and looking at the opportunities in terms of our economic opportunity. So what would that mean if we return that money back to Minnesota and focus on having those renewable energy sources locally owned? It would mean that we can add that back into our bottom line in terms of that economic engine. We can kick it into high gear instead of keeping it in second gear. And we can get as much as $56 billion of economic activity. We could have 100,000 jobs instead of 50,000 jobs. And these are all big numbers, of course, because we're talking about accomplishing something truly remarkable. But the sheer amount of difference between the local ownership and absentee ownership is also very significant. There's one other thing that I want to talk about that's really important when it comes to ownership, and that's something that's increasingly becoming a problem for our renewable energy industry as it expands across the country, is that a lot of people don't want to live near it. And this takes a lot of different forms, and I think the entire conversation is actually really interesting. But some people say, I don't want to live near a wind power project because there's a lot of shadow from the blades that falls over my property, and that flicker is really annoying. Or there's noise from the turbines. Or, I really liked the view before they decided that they were going to come put these turbines here. For example, the Kennedy family is not very interested in the offshore wind project off of Cape Cod, despite being, I think, in all other ways, staunch advocates of clean energy. I think what it comes down to and what some of the studies have shown is really that this is much more about economics. It's just that when you're having a debate about whether or not to put a wind project into your town, you can't make the argument that they're not bringing enough money into your town to stop it. But you can say that it's going to cause you health problems and try to get the county to refuse them the permit. I think this is a really interesting study that was done in Germany that's kind of illustrative of this issue. It looked at 2 different towns. Both of them had a wind farm that was nearby. In one case, it was a community-owned wind farm by people in the town and with shared ownership with the town itself. In the other case, there was no local ownership. And you can see an enormous spread in the amount of support toward having additional wind energy near that town. In the town that had no local ownership, there were only 16% of people had a positive attitude toward expanding wind power production near their town. In the town that had local ownership, 45%, have a positive attitude toward expanding wind power production. We're going to create a constituency for more clean energy if we find a way for people to have a financial stake in it and not just a philosophical stake in it. It's a really enormous issue that we're overlooking, and that as the industry moves forward and grows, it really needs to consider how it's going to find ways to continue to keep people interested in supporting clean energy beyond the sort of baby steps that we've taken so far. So I hope I've made a fairly convincing argument about why we want to pursue clean energy for more than just the clean electricity we can get. But I do want to take a moment to talk about what some of the barriers are to what we affectionately call clean local energy. And there are 3 of them. One is in terms of the way that we provide subsidies to renewable energy in the form of tax incentives. The other one is what we call a utility gridlock. And the third one is in terms of project financing. The first one is tax incentives, and I think the best way to put this is that we unfortunately have this philosophy in this country that if we put things in the tax code, it doesn't cost us anything. This is actually enhanced by the fact that in the federal Congress, if you want to pay for something up front, let's say you wanted to provide somebody $10 to do a solar power project, you would have to authorize yourself to spend $10, and then you'd have to vote again to give them $10. Whereas if you want to say that you can take a $10 tax credit if you build a solar power project, you only need 1 vote. And as anybody knows, in the way that Congress works these days, 1 vote is much better than 2 votes. And that is why we focus so much on tax incentives. The problem with that, of course, is that it leaves out a lot of folks who can't use tax incentives. I've listed a few on the screen there, like cities or nonprofit organizations or even cooperatives, which ironically are probably one of the best legal structures that we have for having more community ownership of our energy infrastructure. But it also becomes a problem even with individuals. There's a fantastic example of a community-owned wind project that was built recently in South Dakota. It's called the South Dakota Wind Partners. It's 7 turbines that were part of a larger wind project of about 110 turbines, I believe, that was built by a rural cooperative. And these 7 turbines are owned collectively by 600 farmers and individuals in South Dakota. But the only way they were able to do this project was that 2 years ago, when the credit crisis hammered every single financing organization that provided financing for wind projects, they went to Congress and they got them to change that tax credit to a cash grant for 2 years. And what that allowed them to do was that in the absence of any taxable income, because none of these businesses had any income during the credit crisis, they were still able to take advantage of the federal incentives and to finance wind and solar projects. With the cash grant, it meant that these organizations like the corn growers and the farmers union and other organizations were able to pull together these 600 people who are folks like farmers who are used to making lots of capital investments for their businesses, and said, hey, we see this real opportunity in this wind project, and because it's in the form of a cash grant, we don't necessarily have to have a lot of taxable income in order to participate. And so they were able to organize all of these folks together and to do this project. And when I called up the guy who helped organize the project and I said, are you going to do this again? This sounds great. I'm sure there's lots of people who would love to do it. He said, well, the tax credit cash grant option ends at the end of this year, and I don't think we're going to be able to see any more projects like it because, unfortunately, we're going to get stuck again with needing all of this kind of tax liability, which means that we have to create these sort of awkward legal partnerships with big banks in order to do these projects, even if all we want to do is have it locally owned. The second piece in terms of a barrier is what we like to call the utility gridlock. And I think the best way to think about this is that, in Minnesota, for example, all of our utilities are regulated. We have a regulated utility market, which means they have a monopoly on their service territory, and that everybody who gets electricity in that service territory gets it from one single provider. It's a great way when you need to build out infrastructure for your utility system to make sure that the right investments are made and that your system is safe and reliable. But we've come to an era in which we have this opportunity to develop clean energy resources that are available anywhere, that we don't need the expertise and financing power to build a gigawatt scale natural gas plant or coal plant in order to produce electricity, that in fact we can do it on our home and business rooftops for significantly cheaper. That we need that opportunity to connect into the utility system to become producers rather than consumers of electricity. But very often the rules and regulations about doing that are controlled by entities who have a financial interest in making sure that we do not, in fact, get that opportunity because their rate of return comes from building those things themselves. And the third one is the financing piece. And this is really tied up in part in the tax credit issue that I talked about earlier. But when somebody goes to the utility and wants to get a contract in order to sell electricity from a renewable energy resource, the utility often will look at whether or not they've already got the financing together in order to do that project, to make sure that it's a real project and not just some sort of phantom, I hope I'm going to be able to build this project if you give me a contract. Well, ironically, the bank wants to see a contract from the utility before they're willing to extend financing for a renewable energy project because they want to know that you're going to have a way to pay off that loan. And so we have this chicken and egg problem with the way that we do our renewable energy policy, in that because it's a difficult and complicated process to get connected to the grid and to get a contract with the utility to sell electricity, it's hard to get financing, and it's hard to get financing because it's hard to get that contract. The good news is that there are some opportunities. I condensed them all to one slide, and I feel bad for that because it makes it seem like there are fewer of them. But I think Lynn already talked about a number of policy opportunities that have been realized or that are moving forward in Minnesota. I want to talk about 3 things that are happening nationwide that I think are very exciting. The first one, obviously, is the use of cash incentives. And we've already seen, although not for the reasons that we would have liked, that the federal government can, in fact, use a cash incentive instead of a tax credit when it's pressed, and that can be much more successful at driving the kind of ownership structure that we would like to see to provide the greatest economic benefit from our clean energy resources. It's something that's been done before in Minnesota as well. There was a cash incentive for wind power before we had our renewable portfolio standard that was for small wind projects, 2 megawatts and under. And it's something that states or utilities sometimes provide in the form of an upfront rebate. but it would be a lot better if we would convert our entire system of incentives to one that was cash-based, so we don't have this bias toward only people that have large income tax bills being able to be developers of renewable energy. The second one is breaking that utility gridlock, and one way that that's happening is in California, where the Public Utility Commission has ordered every single investor-owned utility, the 3 major ones in California, to essentially map out in their distribution system, their low-voltage system that runs through your alleyway and provides electricity to your house, where are the opportunities to plug in renewable energy development? Where are the opportunities, where are the places that the grid needs more electricity support, especially in times of high demand? For example, a hot sunny day when a solar panel will be cranking out lots of power and everybody's got their air conditioner on. They've got, I believe this is the map from Southern California Edison. It's on Google Maps. You can zoom right in and see your street and see if you live near a place where they're looking for opportunities to add electricity. I should say where the utility is looking because the Public Utility Commission told them to look for opportunities to plug into their system. This is the kind of thing that could be done in Minnesota. This is the kind of thing that the Minnesota Public Utility Commission could require of our utilities that would expand the opportunities for more local ownership of renewable energy. The third thing is what we like to call clean contracts, which is a sexy name that we've come up with in the U.S. for what the folks in Europe call a feed-in tariff, which is a disastrous name for a very successful policy that is responsible for half of all of the wind power in the entire world and 3/4 of all the solar power that's ever been installed. And the basic principle behind a clean contract is to mimic what happens with a utility in a regulated state. Right now, if Xcel wants to build a power plant, they go to the Public Utility Commission and they say, we want to build a new power plant to meet this need. And if you find it worthwhile, we want to get a 10% return on our investment. And that's generally what happens. And the Utility Commission, checks everything off, crosses the T's, dots the I's, and says, yes, that's acceptable. A clean contract extends that offer to anybody. It says, we will give you a reasonable return on your investment if you build a solar power plant, a wind power plant, a geothermal power plant. We will give you a long-term contract. The utility will have to buy your power for 20 years, and they have to give you a price sufficient to give you a good return on investment. In Germany, of their enormous renewable energy market that now powers 20% of their electricity system, half of it is owned by individuals and farmers under this kind of program. People have decided that instead of putting their money in a savings account, which in this economy is getting you diddly squat, why not put solar panels on the roof and get a 5 or 6% return on their investment over 20 or 25 years and be an energy producer? They're also, instead of saying to themselves, I'll only put enough solar on my roof to meet my needs, they're saying, I'm going to put as much solar as I can fit on my roof because this is an investment. And what that means is that the Germans are getting better economies of scale on solar than we are in the United States because everybody's building the biggest size system they can for their roof rather than trying to match it to the kinds of policies that we have here that encourage you only to meet the demand that you have in your facility, in your home, in your business. So it's a great policy. It's actually been enacted in 3 states, Vermont, Rhode Island, and Hawaii, and a number of municipal utilities are also considering doing this policy because they're usually free from Public Utility Commission regulation and can pursue this kind of policy on their own. So there's some tremendous opportunities in terms of ways to break open the economic development options for renewable energy. I'm going to leave it there because I want to give George some time to talk before we have questions, but thank you so much.
Thank you, John. And I know that you are all getting a lot of questions that are coming up. And after we hear from George, we're going to open it up for questions. Some of the things you were talking about brought a lot of memories back. I mean, like with getting it to the local ownership. After we did the renewable energy standard, I put a bill through that directed the state to develop an economic development plan based off of the renewable energy standards, simply to do just that, to get more local ownership. And it's but it takes leadership, to drive those things through. And I know from our next speaker that he's been working a lot on nuclear issues as well, and some of the nuclear, how the nuclear development and whether or not it's the right thing to do in the state. And I've taken a clear position on that as well. And I know if we talked about some of the slides about how much money is spent in the state on energy. You know, a new nuclear power plant minimum is going to cost $10 billion, and that's the starting point, and it'll go up from there as it gets developed. So if we could take that $10 billion and put it into renewables, we could have a lot more jobs and a lot healthier environment off of that. So those are the things that we got to keep in mind. Our next speaker, he's been around a long time. He's a very, very smart man, very articulate speaker. Please welcome George Crocker.
Thank you, Senator. It's really good to be here. My name is George Crocker. I'm the Executive Director of the North American Water Office, which is an organization that my wife and I co-founded back in 1982 in the wake of the power line struggle. Maybe some of you remember a power line issue that faced Minnesota back in the late 70s and early 80s. Out of that came the North American Water Office, with the understanding that people in communities really aren't represented in the decisions that are being made about how energy services get provided. And so the North American Water Office was formed essentially to help provide a voice for people in those communities to learn quickly about how to participate in decision-making structures, and more importantly, over time, to understand the relationship between energy development, the environment, economic development, and public health types of issues as we provide utility services. How do those things fit together or not as we make the decisions to keep the lights on? And so with that in mind, we've been involved since the late 70s with power line issues, with nuclear issues, as Senator mentioned, with acid rain, with global climate chaos. It's not warming, it's chaos, with particulate problems, with a lot of community-based energy, the seabed work, a lot of the policy issues that have brought us to this point have been the result. You can trace a line all the way back to that power line fight back in the late 70s and early 80s, and the landowners in west central Minnesota that really helped us understand the role that we can all be playing in terms of how we do provide electric utility services. So Lynn and John have done, I think, a really, really good job of helping us understand a little bit of the potential that's out there for getting energy right. We can do this right. The technologies are all available. The policy options are all available. The social structures are all available. So let's just do it. Well, my job here tonight is to sort of examine the role of community organizing that needs to happen in order to fulfill the promise that Lynn and John so marvelously put in front of us. And to begin that examination, I think we need to step back a little bit and look at a little bit of history. Some of you remember that all the way back in 1974, Minnesota passed a law, and this was in the wake of the first Arab oil embargo, when we had that energy crisis, that gas lines and at the pumps and all of that. We passed a law in 1974 that says Minnesota has a vital interest in conservation and renewable energy, in energy efficiency. And it is the policy of the state of Minnesota to prioritize the types of options that are used for providing energy services, with the first priority being efficiency, conservation, because that's the cheapest and the quickest. And then it's renewable energy, because it's locally available and it's clean and it's quick and you can do it here. And then you move on down to the natural gas and the coal and the garbage burners and the nuclear and all of that. But they prioritized them. 74. Now, fast forward 20 years to 1994. You'd think that in 20 years, with the technologies that were in place and with the policies that were enacted in statute, that we would have made some progress towards that conservation and that renewable energy. but we didn't. The percentages of energy in Minnesota that came from coal and nukes and natural gas were the same in 1994 as they were 20 years before that. The same. There was one thing then in 1994 and 95 in that time frame that happened to jerk it a little bit. And that had to do with community organizing. That had to do with Prairie Island. The power company needed more storage space for its waste. The failure of the federal government, failure of all of us to actually learn how to manage irradiated fuel, which must be isolated from biological activity for 240,000 years. Anybody got any ideas on how to really do that? Well, that's a problem. And the nuclear industry ran up against it in Minnesota with Prairie Island, and we had a brouhaha at the state legislature. The legislators still talk about it with it. But out of that, even though we got rolled, they got the additional storage capacity. But then for the first time, we actually jerked the utility industry into the modern era in terms of renewable energy. They'd been doing it in Europe all over the place in '94. The technologies were mature and ripe. It's not a technology issue. It's a market share issue. That's what it's about. Remember the 20 billion that Lynn talked about? That's market share. The reason that we will not get any of that promise, well, maybe a little bit of it around the edges, unless there is really intense community organizing, is because every single bit of the work that needs to be done in order to secure the promise that Lynn and John talked about, every bit of that cuts into the market share of the cartel operators in the energy industry. And that's why it's not an accident that we have the tax policy that we have. It is not an accident. It is not an accident that the grid is operated the way it's operated. It's to protect market share. It's to protect the vested interest of the cartels that serve and provide the electric utility industries. And if you stop and think about why do they get away with it, well, how many, no, I'm not going to do that. There's very few people, for example, that understand the difference between a kilowatt hour and a megawatt. Well, okay. Everybody knows what a 100-watt light bulb is, right? A 100-watt light bulb, if you take 10 of them, that's 10 times 100, that's 1,000 watts, that's 1 kilowatt. If you burn those 10 light bulbs for 1 hour, it takes 1 kilowatt hour of energy to produce it. It takes 1 kilowatt of capacity to turn them all on at the same time. Okay, so this is just basic nomenclature here, just the fundamentals. And the point here is that we as a society are functionally illiterate relative to energy, relative to how it is that our lights come on. And when you're talking about a system that is complicated and complex as the electric utility system is, I mean, the engineers on the transmission system, they get into square roots of negative numbers. That's imaginary stuff to figure out power flows. So it's a very complicated system. When people don't understand and don't know, are illiterate about how the system operates, the vested interests walk. And that's what they've done. And so even though the technologies are available and have been for a long time to do all of these wonderful things in terms of cleaner environment, of local economic development, of jobs, of wealth to communities, even though the opportunity is all there, it won't happen. It will not happen unless and until enough people figure out how to actively pursue their interest, their community's interest, in securing the benefits that John and Lynn talked about. And that has to do with community organizing. That has to do with energy neighborhoods. Where is your energy neighborhood? Well, it's easy to understand where an energy neighborhood is regarding the electric utility system in a more rural setting, because it's everybody within the footprint of a substation. And it's within that footprint that the organizing needs to happen in our rural communities and in the small towns around Minnesota. And we've done that. We've tried to do that. We did that, and we even mapped out a way to do it that had to do with the open data information that California has. We did it before they did in Minnesota. We passed a law. Senator Dole was important with the passage of that law to help us understand what the opportunity of the existing grid is to take energy, collect energy from dispersed and distributed generators and deliver it to load. We thought, okay, it's one thing to make great big huge wind farms that mimic the central station machines that John was talking about in that one slide, and build big power lines to those big wind farms that are owned by the Iberdrolas and the other cartels. But it's another thing to understand how to strategically site and size generation so it fits within the existing system. So that we say, okay, right now, within a footprint of a given substation, and the capacity of the transformers at that substation are, say, 5 megawatts. Well, you could do 5 megawatts there, right there, because that's the load that's in there. Some fraction of that will be used within that footprint because that's where the consumers are. But the transformers don't care which way the power flows. They're transformers, so you can push more back up. You could do more than 5 megawatts for each of those substations that have a 5 megawatt transformer. Well, we did the analysis. We actually passed a law that said we're going to analyze how to strategically size and locate new generation in such a way that we optimize the efficiency of the existing grid and then use that optimization to inform the decision about how to enhance the higher voltage system moving on up. Well, you know, the cartels got away with it again, because even though we were able to demonstrate how an enormous opportunity to use the grid more efficiently, the cartels at the time, and they're still involved with it, wanted what they called a CapEx 2020 transmission system. And if we're busy figuring out how literally thousands of megawatts in Minnesota could fit within the existing structures, existing infrastructure, and modest enhancements, why that would undermine the need to build the big power lines that the cartels need to service their wind farms. And so they lied. They just straight out lied. They lied to the legislature. They lied right in front of Senator Dahl. I don't think he even knew it. But they did about what that study said. And the proof of it is that with the open data stuff that John talked about in California, where they took the kind of information and the kind of analysis that we originated here and applied it in California, they found in California why over 30% of the installed generation capacity could be dispersed and distributed. Over 30%. In Minnesota, that would amount to well over 3,000 megawatts of capacity that you could almost put in right now if you strategically size it. The study that we made them do, they said, oh, maybe we can do 50. That's the extent of the lie. So, you know, the power company and the cartel interests will do what it takes them to do in order to preserve their market share. And unless and until there's enough community organizing and people who are informed enough about the difference between kilowatt hours and megawatts and know what their interests are, until that happens, why the power of the organized capital will prevail. Organized people can beat organized capital every time that the people are organized. Problem is, we're not. So in order to bring us to the promise that is absolutely there, why there's a social dimension, a community organizing dimension that is absolutely critical. With it, we can do this. Without it, there'll just be a little bit of piddling around the side. And in the meanwhile, we'll see a continuation of the type of economic deterioration, social structure deterioration, warring, all of those other security types of issues that happen when cartel interests are in control. So, thank you.
Very nice. Say, now, we wanted to open, we got about, I think, 15 to 20 minutes left to open up to questions. Did we want to bring you guys up in front or back here? How did we want to do this? Right behind, so they get the microphone. So if you guys will come up, I guess I'm going to be the moderator here. If you've got questions, I'll direct them. And if you want to just stand up and tell us your name, too, and then ask your question, that would be great.
My name is Ben Kuriakis. I'm a small business owner. I also represent small business in Minnesota. I have a question for you, Lynn. Can you tell us a little bit about the Minnesota Small Industries Association, Solar Industries Association, how many members there are, and who have you partnered with so far? And I'd like to hear if you've done anything with any Chamber of Commerce.
The question was, what is MNSEA, Minnesota Solar Energy Industry Association, and what have we done to partner with different organizations, but in particular the Chamber? MNSEA is a membership organization of 41 different businesses. You heard me talk some earlier about installation. We have relatively small installers that are part of our membership. We've got contractors who are not necessarily dedicated to doing solar. For example, Hunt and other electrical contractors who do a portion of their contracting that's solar dedicated. We've got utilities that are part of the organization, both IOUs and munis. We have a number of manufacturers, 3M, Crenlo, MCOR, 10K Solar, Silicon Energy. We've got developers, those people who represent or are working in the training areas of the economy. And we've had some interface with folks in the Chamber on the local level, have contact with the folks that are doing policy work at the state level. And there's an organization called the Clean Energy Network, which is an organization of business interests and capital, venture capital and early stage capital that we're involved with. In fact, I'll be speaking at an event that they're having. It's a networking event tomorrow evening. I think that answers your questions.
One more. What kind of budget do you have, and have you found the chambers helpful or not helpful?
Well, I think, we've got a modest budget. We're membership driven. We're a 501c6 because we want to be engaged in policy work. And, like any organization, you could look at unions. They are pretty consistent in their support of the clean energy economy. That didn't used to be, but that's been a change. You see a lot of movement on the part of businesses in general to embrace the clean energy economy. And I think you're seeing a shift in chambers. I would not say... at the national level, I'll just take the example. Recently, the National Chamber suggested that President Obama do an executive order that's virtually identical to the executive order that we put in place in our state that would help scale up the retrofit of public buildings, at least that are federally owned. So, there's a positive example. I could give some that probably aren't as positive as well.
Someone else. No more questions. I know there's more questions.
I'm Bob Gruber with the United Energy and Environment Committee. One of the barriers that I've heard about is storing. How are we going to store the electricity generated, solar and wind, when we don't have sun or we don't have wind? We'll still need, then they argue, we'll still need fossil fuels to keep the system going.
Take a stab at it. The question was about energy storage, and I think that's a very good question, and one I think that's often wielded against renewable energy a little bit unfairly. I didn't put it in my slide deck because it was getting long enough, and because it's sometimes for a little more technical audience. But one of the greatest tools that we have in terms of managing the variability of renewable energy resources is dispersing them over a wider area. There's a really great study that was done through the Lawrence Berkeley National Labs in California, that if you dispersed about 25 solar installations over the size of a metropolitan area, you drop the cost to the utility of backing up those installations down to fractions of a cent per kilowatt hour, to a rather negligible amount. Now, does that mean we don't need backup? No, but it means that the amount of backup that we need significantly shrinks because it's only cloudy in it's generally not cloudy in the same in over a wide area all at the same time. And as to the other variability, I think there's some great example of some testimony before the California Public Utility Commission on managing intermittency of solar, and they talked about the fact that utilities, have suggested that there are significant costs to backing up solar because of its variability. But one of the presenters noted that there are really two kinds of variability with solar. There's when it's cloudy and when it's not. And we do have meteorologists, and their forecasts are not perfect, but they are decent. And so we do have some predictive power that's being used in the renewable energy industry for both wind and solar to predict the effects of weather. And we kind of know, in general, when it's going to be daytime and when it's going to be nighttime, the other variability for solar. And so that's relatively manageable. And it just so happens, too, that solar tends to produce during the daytime when we use electricity more, and then at nighttime when we don't. So to answer the first part, we don't need as much storage as you think, or backup. And the second part is certainly we will need some backup and some storage. And right now that can be provided by, for example, Denmark has about 25%, or 20 to 25% of its electricity from wind, gets a great deal of its storage from Norwegian hydropower. Because when they're producing a great deal of wind power that they can't use, they ship that electricity to Norway and they pump water up through the dams. And then when they need electricity back in Denmark, they run the water back through the turbines and send the electricity back.
Do we have a comparable capacity in this country?
There is a substantial amount, and I couldn't tell you off the top of my head, of untapped storage capacity like that that has not been explored before. There is also a great deal of research going into how we rethink the way that we manage our grid, because part of the reason we get in the conversation is that we have lots of old coal power plants that are only efficient to run if they're run all the time. And so the utility perspective is we want to run this all the time first, and we also don't have to deal with your renewable energy stuff. That's inconvenient. But if we can change the conversation to one of we actually just need to match when people use electricity with how we can produce it from whatever source, wind, sun, etc., it changes the conversation a great deal, and we stop having to have stupid conversations about running really old, dirty coal plants and smarter conversations about how do we find ways to innovatively match our load with our production.
Just to build on that for an instant, really storage issues only system-wide become issues when you get into much higher percentages of the renewables and actually make the transition. We're nowhere near. I mean, the system itself acts as a storage system up until the time where you get upwards of 30% a penetration of wind, for example, and we're nowhere near that now. So the system itself has that capacity into the foreseeable future, unfortunately. Beyond that, battery technologies are advancing very, very rapidly. There's some very interesting work going on with hybrid systems, for example, wind hydrogen systems that could be possible. And there's various other hybrids and storage medium that can be used in site-specific locations. The transmission system, the power grid can be divided into two main chunks. There's the transmission system, which is the high voltage system, which takes the power from where it's generated conventionally at the central station, the great big huge power plants, ships it long distances to the load centers where it hits a substation, and then it's transformed back into lower voltage and fed out into the community where it's served. So it's the distribution network on the one hand, and the high voltage system on the other. And what we're finding is that with the modern technologies, the wind, the photovoltaic, all of these manufactured technologies, if you look at Central Station, they're all custom built. They're great, big, huge things. They take a long time to build. They're cheaper per unit as they get bigger. That economy of scale has fundamentally changed now, and this is what's one of the things that drives the potential that Lynn and John were talking about, because now think about all of the photovoltaic systems or the wind turbines or the fuel cells or any of the modern technologies, the switches for the smart grid, the high-efficiency refrigerators, they're all manufactured in mass-produced quantities, which means that instead of cheaper as we get bigger, the modern system gets cheaper as we make more of it and spread it out, which gets us higher efficiencies in the transmission. It's the transmission study that I was talking about, where if we strategically size and locate new generation, we can use the existing infrastructure much more efficiently than by building more big power plants or big power lines to remote generators that are way distant from the load centers. If you get strategic in how you size your generators, why then you can site new generation within the footprint of the distribution system, serve the distribution load within that footprint of that substation, whether it's in city or in the country, and if you're producing more than you're using in that particular footprint, the transformer, like I say, doesn't care, and it can push the electrons back up onto the higher voltage system for distribution to another load.
I just wanted to, one of the things that I think it's appropriate at this point in the discussion to both concur with what George said earlier about developing our literacy about our energy policy, but I think just as critical is to develop a literacy about economic development. And so, for example, you've seen not necessarily a contrast, but in the presentation that I give, I've heard people say, yeah, I hear what you're saying about jobs, I hear what you're saying about economic development, but where's the energy policy piece of this? Well, the problem is that when we get sequestered, if you will, into that discussion, there's a lot of detail, and George does a great job of helping to simplify that. But we have to be careful about not being drawn into that narrow stripe of the discussion. As much as we need to develop our literacy there, we need to really understand how this is a driver for economic development and not get trapped into losing that vital message as we're going forward in this discussion.
I met someone who's working on just what I think George Crocker is addressing, and that is community organizing to develop energy production, I think, and efficiency in the Phillips neighborhood. And he's been doing that for about 7 years. Timothy, yes. I was wondering, what would you say, or how would you recommend community organizations helping to spread if he's doing a good job, his example, and how you do that, and getting more people engaged? And at some point, is he risking having to really go up against the cartels and possibly being, pursued or arrested? I've wondered about that.
Thank you very much for that question. Timothy's a hero. He's a modern-day hero. He's the kind of person that makes me proud of the career that I've had. To see a young man come up and do the kind of organizing that he's doing in South Minneapolis, it's larger than just the Phillips neighborhood. But that's the best example we have right now in an urban setting in Minnesota, certainly, of people within community attempting to understand their energy interests and organize themselves to serve those energy interests. And they're doing absolutely excellent work, and anything you can do to support them or to join with them or to expand on what they're doing, take the models that they're using and are developing and apply them in other communities around the cities, that would just be wonderful. He's providing the kind of leadership that actually gives me some hope.
And are they producing in that area, or are they
They're-
sort of efficiency projects?
Well, they're in the very initial stages. They're still in the educating and organizing. They're trying to understand the relationship between them, the communities that they're serving, the service providers, Excel. How do all of those moving parts fit? There's an awful lot to sort out, but they are looking at how to both do much efficiency, and that can be done quicker and sooner because it's not quite as complicated as trying to hook stuff onto the distribution network or the power line system.
But it still provides jobs.
It does. Yep. There's huge. They did an end use analysis, which simply means how much electricity is used in this community for residential lights or for industrial motors throughout every end use sector by sector, and they identified how many millions of dollars just out of that 20 billion that Lynn talked about, how many millions, and I think it was like 50 million bucks. 63 million. That's what's at stake. That's the market share that they are contending with. Now, how that relates to what Excel does and the other service providers, that's part of the art, and that has to do with community organizing. The more people he has working, the more people that are working together with that, the more of a voice they have, the more of an ability they have to contend their interests versus the conventional utility interest, and it is contention.
Hi, yes. I'm Catherine from Northeast Minneapolis. One of my neighbors in Northeast Minneapolis wanted to go completely off the grid. So this was probably 6 years ago when he was telling me this story. And he wanted to do the solar panels on his roof. He has a good site and good exposure and all that. He had the battery equipment in his basement, and geothermal was also part of this. And with the intention of actually selling his excess electricity back to the grid. And at that time, there was only a $3,000 federal tax credit or rebate of some kind, which would leave him $9,000 short. This whole thing would cost him $12,000. Fast forward to now, and he never did it because of the cost. He didn't have that extra $9,000 in his pocket, being that he's now starting a family. So my question is, what help is there, or what laws can we get in place to help individual homeowners that just want to do these projects on their own to be able to do a project like Mark wanted to do? Because here's a person who was willing to do more than his share on conservation and was financially blocked from that.
We're pointing at each other. Senator Dahl and I, were successful at getting enabling legislation in 2010 for property assessed clean energy, which is essentially the answer. It's a mechanism to help finance. It doesn't promote incentives or subsidies. It's a mechanism to help overcome that initial cost hurdle for doing energy efficiency and renewable energy installations. And the problem is that right now the residential piece of that has been stalled because of an issue, a prohibition that was put on residential financing of PACE loans or financing by Fannie and Freddie, the Federal Housing Finance Agency. There's two sub groupings there. We've been able to continue to do commercial and industrial. In fact, we've got a couple of people sitting in the audience tonight that are working aggressively with us on a pilot program for Edina in that area that would use PACE financing. And I'd be happy to talk about it a little bit later on. But the essence of it is that you're able to, secure the payment through a special assessment on your property taxes and use that mechanism to ensure the savings that you get from the energy efficiency and the energy generated get paid over a longer period of time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, we're close to our time, so we'll have maybe for 2 more questions. And we'll go with you first.
Sheila Gary, for most of my adult life, the electricity I've received has come through cooperatives, first Frost Bengal in southern Minnesota and now Dakota Electric. In talking about how cooperatives can be formed to do this kind of thing, are you looking at one or the other or both, creating new cooperatives or having current members of cooperatives start going to their meetings and say, hey, we need to do this, this, and this? What are you looking at?
Both of my colleagues here are looking at me and saying both, and that's the truth. It's the issue, of course, is when we're looking at cooperatives, we do have obviously a lot of electricity in this country already delivered by cooperatives, and those member-driven organizations, at least in theory, should be able to be more responsive in terms of clean energy and consider some of the economic benefits and beyond just the electricity. And I'm sure, as George could talk more about, that's not as easy as it should be. And then, of course, there's people looking to form new cooperatives, for example, who are served by an investor-owned utility and who want to find a way to collaborate in order to do renewable energy projects. And as I mentioned in my presentation, you get stymied very often by the federal incentives and also by the fact that a traditional cooperative is organized around sharing its output. And there's no way legally to share electricity output from, for example, a wind turbine. 600 people could own a wind turbine and would be able to share the output fairly equally, 600 homeowners, but there's no way to set it up to actually send that electricity to 600 people. And the legal tiptoeing that has gone around trying to make that happen is complicated enough that we haven't gotten very far.
One final question. Yes, sir.
All right, you look this way. Thank you. I have a question for John about the cost data, 11 cents per kilowatt hour for wind and 22 cents per kilowatt hour for solar. Whatever the investment is, whenever an investment is made, you have to amortize it over some period of time in order to come up with these sorts of numbers. So the question is, what is the period of time? But before you answer that, I'd just like to add a little bit more about my background. I put up a wind turbine over 10 years ago at my place. I live out in Crocker. It's a 20 kilowatt 8-volt system. And generally in this area, it can generate 500 to 1,000 kilowatt hours per month. And with Minnesota's net metering law, say it's 1,000 kilowatt hours a month and 10 cents a kilowatt hour, then that's only $100 a month. So you can't pay off a very expensive system in a short period of time. Now our utility, Frank Henry Electric's been very open and they've helped us, and we actually put a demo up for them at their site. They paid for it in 2007. And you can go to their website and you can see how wind performs, and they've done the same thing with solar, and you can see how solar performs. But the problem with small wind is that, I'm an advocate of it, and I would like to see a lot more distributed small wind, but the problem is the initial investment. You can't make the economics work unless you spread it out for 100 years.
To your question about the way that I calculated the costs in terms of the wind and solar, I looked at for wind, it's a 20-year project life and a 10-year financing term. So, you get a 10-year loan, basically. I could go into great detail about the spreadsheets that go into making those estimates. But basically, your upfront cost is about $1,800 a kilowatt because we're looking at utility scale turbines, so a megawatt or 2 megawatts a pop. I'm not looking at the small scale turbines. And so that's where the wind numbers come from. And then the solar numbers, it's, I believe, about $4 a watt. And that's about where we're at for commercial scale solar in terms of costs across the country. And to your point about financing, that's part of what Lynn was talking about with the PACE program. Just the elevator speech on PACE is, I have to replace my furnace in my house. I know I'm going to move in 5 years. It costs $1,000 extra to buy the energy efficient model. Why should I spend $1,000? It's not going to pay back. Well, if I can pay for it through a property tax assessment that will pass to the next homeowner, I do have an incentive to do it because I will see the energy efficiency benefit in the 5 years I live there, and they will also realize that energy efficiency benefit and share the cost of it. And ideally, the additional cost of that energy efficient model will be more than made up for by the energy savings of it. And that can be true for all sorts of things that you can do in terms of home energy efficiency improvements as well as renewable energy systems. So that's the beauty of that program. And of course, to go back to what George has talked about cartels, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, through the Federal Housing Finance Agency, put the kibosh on residential PACE programs in July of last year, saying that it provided a safety and soundness risk to their portfolios, which is incredibly ironic during the credit crisis, especially because default. Yeah, they know a whole lot about that. But that's where we're at, essentially, is that we have this opportunity to unlock enormous amounts of potential through a policy that really aligns everybody's interests in terms of energy efficiency, and it's being kicked around by folks who are really just looking to cover their butts.
So I actually work in publishing, not energy, but I feel as though I'm ready to go to work tomorrow in a whole other industry. So I would like to thank John and George and Lynn, and please give them a round of applause. And an extra round of applause because John Farrell touched on this earlier, but the early notion of this forum actually does stem in large part from John's expertise and participation. So please make sure that certain that John gets an extra special. And if you're going away tonight and you want more, there is more. On November 1st, at this exact same location, we will be hosting Ellen Anderson, Dean Abrahamson, and Barbara Fries. To carry on the topic, that discussion is going to be state and national policy for increasing renewable energy. So again, please give our speakers this evening a round of applause. They were great, and hopefully I will see you on November 1st.